In the month since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began, more than 3.5 million people have fled, the fastest moving refugee crisis since World War II. It's been a nightmare for millions of families, torn apart as Russian forces attack healthcare facilities, schools and buildings intended as safe havens for civilians. No place is safe. So the people who can leave have been taking the exhausting journey to anywhere but there. Some of the most affected are Ukraine's children. According to UNICEF, more than 4 million Ukrainian children have been displaced. That's half of all the country's children. Nearly 2 million of them have become refugees, fleeing into countries like Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary and Moldova, along with mostly women and the elderly. There's an outpouring of support from European countries for taking them in, with America now opening its borders too. The US, as I just mentioned, says it will welcome up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees fleeing that war, and that is great to see. But there's a dark side to this mass movement of desperate people, something that we all need to be very concerned about. A population movement of this size comes with all the dangers of gangs, of abuse, and yes, of human trafficking. Authorities fear a surge in trafficking as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. Already, charity groups tell The Guardian that women and children are being targeted, with the group Missing Children Europe saying unaccompanied minors are shockingly disappearing at the border. With hundreds of Ukrainian children arriving in neighboring countries alone, it's especially terrifying and unimaginable. So who is protecting these kids from predators waiting at the border to harm them? What can the rest of the world do? Here now to discuss this is UNICEF spokesperson James Elder, who's on the ground in Lviv, Ukraine, and abuse prevention specialist Rosalia Rivera. She's the chair of SAGE, Survivor Advocates Globally Empowered. Thank you both for being on the show. James, you have said that 50 Ukrainian kids every minute since the start of this conflict have become refugees. Dare I ask, how many of those 50 every minute do you think have ended up in the hands of gangs or traffickers already? This is a major problem, is it not?
It's a terrifying problem. It keeps us awake at night. It's impossible to say. The vast majority of these children did leave with mothers. Remembering that means they're traumatized. They left, as you rightly said there, Mehdi, they left conflict, they left bunkers, they left under shelling, and they left fathers. You know, the separation from that father figure en masse for these children, 1.8 million in a month. But yes, because of the speed at which they left and because most countries just opened their borders, which was the right thing to do, but trafficking is that risk. Traffickers don't see this as a crisis. They see this as an opportunity. So there's certain things that absolutely now need to happen to protect these kids from this horror of trafficking.
Rosalia, walk us through how these predators target and approach refugees in situations like this. And how bad do you think the problem right now is for Ukrainian women and children in places like Poland and Hungary?
Yes, it is absolutely a terrible thing. And what we're seeing is, in many cases, that volunteers who, should be Good Samaritans, traffickers are posing as Good Samaritans, and children and families who are, they're exhausted, they're coming through these very stressful situations, and they are not being able to really determine who is good and who is bad. And so these traffickers are taking advantage of these situations and, registering with unregistered, refugees. This is absolutely a critical issue. So what we're seeing is these traffickers are taking advantage, many times separating children from their parents, and this is how they are moving children away.
James, what have we learned from past crises when it comes to the role that trafficking plays, especially, for example, I'm thinking of the Syrian crisis in Europe in 2015?
Well, we learned a lot, mostly that those neighbouring countries, the longer a conflict goes on, the longer you see this indiscriminate attacks and in civilian areas, Mehdi, the way warfare's changed, the more those neighbouring countries bear the brunt. So in Syria, of course, it's Lebanon, Lebanon, particularly, and Jordan who bear the brunt there. But what we've also learned, as your other guest there speaks of, is that traffickers thrive in these situations. So we need a few things. We need, as she rightly points out there, that Yeah, and unless you know a family member, unless you have that family contact, we don't need people offering private transport at borders. We need robust undercover police work. We need governments to coordinate, with organisations like Interpol and so on. And it's not just at borders now, because, as you rightly say, 3.5 million people, 1.8 million kids have already moved in. So we need to start registration in those countries, and a lot of that can be done through offering services so people can register. So everyone's a little bit behind the 8 ball because, as you said, to go back one step as well, what we learned from Syria, I don't like to compare tragedies, because Syria is ongoing and it remains a horror show for mums and dads and kids there. The Syrian crisis, it was 2.5 years. It took 2.5 years for 1 million children to become refugees, 1 million. It took 2 weeks here. 2 weeks for 1 million kids. So that kind of outflux is why there's this horrible risk that we're trying to combat now, but everyone's coming to it late.
And Rosalia, just picking up on what James is saying, what do we think about international safeguards? What do we think about what governments should be doing right now, putting in place at the international level? What are you calling for?
Yes, well, the council in Germany is calling for registration of refugees. This is a really critical piece that needs to be implemented in all of the neighboring countries, because if they're not getting registered, they are going to be missing. I mean, there's already many that have gone missing, and this is just a very vulnerable population at the moment who is being dispersed so quickly that it's hard to keep track. And if we don't register right away, if we're not putting these measures into place, these children are unprotected. So we absolutely need to, the German Council is calling for that, and they are putting pressure on other countries that are neighboring to also do the same. And they need resources. So the governments need to support the communities and municipalities that are doing the work on the ground with parents, family-supported units, community-supported units to be able to help all of these incoming refugees.
Sadly, most discussions on this show about crises does tend to go back to that one word, resources. We need resources. James, let me ask you this. We've been talking about people fleeing Ukraine and what's going on across the border. You're inside of Ukraine in Lviv. What is the situation like on the ground where you are? Can you describe that to us? What's happening there?
Yeah, in Lviv, it's relatively safe, Mehdi. I mean, I say that. I spoke to a doctor today and she's terrified. She's at a maternity hospital and they've had airstrikes. She's convinced they're mapping out additional strikes. So this place is relatively safe, Mehdi, but it's a sea of sorrow and sadness. It's everywhere I turn around. It's thousands of mums and husbands and wives farewelling each other. Dads trying to explain to their 8-year-old daughters why they're leaving. Or, as I saw today, pregnant mums, very pregnant mums, 36, 37 weeks, sitting underground in bunkers because of air raid sirens. So, it's safe, but it's a place of war, and they're terrified there's going to be attacks. Most of those mums I saw, by the way, the ones who are pregnant, are going to have preterm babies because of the stress, because they spent days and days in bunkers in Kharkiv or Kiev, and they've come here. So this is a relatively safe place, but particularly those new mothers or nurses and paediatricians are very nervous because they've seen attacks on hospitals across this country, and they don't have any trust that they may not be next, and their patients and those mothers may not be next.
God, well, that is stark, I think it's fair to say. Rosalia, last question to you before we run out of time, very quickly. Do you think attitudes will change towards migration, towards the challenge of trafficking because of Ukraine, or will we just all go back to business as usual?
Well, hopefully it's not going back to business as usual. The goal is for countries to take action immediately. We cannot waste time. I think it's great that some areas, like with the blue dots that UNICEF is instilling, that can help. But we need to take action immediately. The longer that we wait, the more children disappear and go into the hands of traffickers.
You're right. Time is not on our side. James Elder and Rosalia Rivera, thank you both for your time tonight. Thank you both for what you do. And James, please do stay safe in Ukraine.